In this video, we're going to have a look at how to interpret the economic activity within an area. And we need to consider that economic activity is often going to be aligned with the type of settlement that is in a region. Because where people settle, they obviously need to function economically, and obviously the way in which they have settled is determined by how they want to function. So if we consider the types of economic activity, the branches or the sectors that we get our primary, our secondary, and our tertiary being the main ones that we're going to focus on. And our primary economic activity is where we are extracting raw materials from the ground. And so we need lots of ground in order to do this. So you're going to see less settlement and more use of the surrounding land in order to actually carry out the primary activity. In terms of our primary activity examples, we're looking at agriculture, types of agriculture, and we're going to look at mining. And so both of those methods are extracting and using the land in order to actually take a resource from the land and then sell that resource on further down that value chain. So if we consider agriculture firstly as part of our primary economic activity, we can see that obviously there's lots of land being used with our settlements kind of integrated within that land or near that land being used. And so we need to consider being able to see the difference firstly between the types of farming. So our two main topics that we've got, or the two main types of farming in South Africa, which gives us a dual agricultural system, is our subsistence type farming that we have, as well as then the opposite, which is the commercial farming. Okay. Now, subsistence farming is where you're farming to produce food for your family. So you're not doing this on a large scale. It's all going to be small scale. You don't generally have a huge amount of capital input or a large amount of money to buy huge amounts of land. And you also obviously don't have lots of money to set up agriculture or infrastructure like your irrigation systems. It is done on a small scale. You're just really creating food for a family. Now, often in a South African context, we're not doing things in isolation just for ourselves. People live within a rural environment, especially subsistence farmers. They're going to often live in a village. And so as a community, we then can do communal subsistence farming. And there we kind of just taking the subsistence method and making it bigger so that we can share the land and share those resources, share the actual produce with the community, with the village. We're also looking at sharing the costs and sharing the equipment. So it makes the whole process easier. But we're not necessarily doing this with the intention, sole intention of selling all the produce and making a profit. A large portion of that produce is actually used for individual consumption, family consumption, or the consumption within the village. And if there's surplus, then certainly that can be sold, and that's a wonderful way for a community to actually develop economically and make money, maybe grow their disposable income, but the majority of the produce is used on a subsistence basis. So what we can see, and is often very clear in a South African sense, is that our subsistence farms will possibly, if it is done on a communal basis, like in this instance, you'll have the symbol for cultivated land. Okay, so that's not necessarily indicating that it's either commercial or subsistence, so don't be fooled. But what you will find, and this is why we say the settlement and economic go hand in hand, is that our village is actually dispersed and scattered throughout the farmlands. So the houses are found within the actual farmland, and the land is being utilized as a settlement site as well as to actually farm and create produce. So we often see evidence of these little sort of individual houses making up that village, scattered throughout that landscape, and that is a very common South African example of our subsistence farming within, or communal subsistence farming within a village setup. Okay. The other things we can say, well, why is this then going to be classified as subsistence farming, is we see very little evidence of irrigation systems. So yes, you can see there are rivers, and so that is convenient that those rivers are located there, and possibly a reason why that village decided to locate there. So we talk about our site factors that would have influenced the choice, okay? That river water would then be useful in watering the plants, but there's no way that the water is being diverted from the river to the farmlands. There's no furrows, there's no canals, we don't see evidence of dams. All of the actual irrigation infrastructure that would cost money, that you would need commercial profits in order to actually develop. Okay, so that's often why we can then conclude that this region is then an example of subsistence farming. Okay. Then in contrast, you can actually see here's the boundary dividing the two areas. You then are seeing, if this was our subsistence side, okay, then our commercial farming is happening just across the boundary here. So what you'll find is that there is a large scale farm of cultivated land. There's no boundaries separating this out necessarily into small little intensive farms. This whole region is going to be a farm, okay? And obviously we've only got a snippet of the map, so we can't really get a full idea of the landscape. But that large scale there indicates that generally, without having any border lines, is commercial farming that's taking place. We can often look for farm names that gives us an indication of commercial farming, because you're obviously naming your business, okay? So if we take it down to the example here of our small scale farms, you can see, I'm just going to use a different color for it to be more obvious, the number of farms in this area, okay? All these farm names indicating commercial farms, but also indicating that the land is being used very intensively in small scale farming, okay? Another thing that's indicating that it's commercial in this example is the number of irrigation systems. Okay, lots of reservoirs, lots of commercial profit is being, or money, capital that's being generated is being used to actually create that infrastructure. So we've got reservoirs dotted across the landscape. We've got lots of dams that have been built to obviously store water and to provide water to that region. And then you've got extensive canal networks, which are obviously helping to channel that water from the various rivers into the actual farmlands. So the evidence of that irrigation or those irrigation systems is then obviously going to show the commercial nature of the farming. Always have a look for accessibility to transport routes. Here you can see that there's really good access to transport routes for the farming region. So obviously helping in terms of its commercial nature. We want to be able to take our products and place them on the secondary road and then transport them out, maybe move them to the railway station so that they can be transported by train, or to the actual highway, the N1, and transported to a market. So that accessibility to a transport network is crucial for commercial farmers to take that end product to the next stage of the value chain. Then often we can see individual farmhouses as well. If it's commercial by nature, you're not going to just maybe, I mean, here you can see there's farmhouses dotted across, but remember that a farm is not only ever made up of one house. Sometimes you've got various buildings that are going to be used in the farming process for storage and for equipment and just basically to support the activity that's taking place. Another thing that is a good example of commercial farming in a region, and often we see it more with our large-scale farming, is the evidence of silos. So silos are those big storage facilities. Okay, I can find a picture, but it's going to be like a big tall tower, sometimes refrigerated, and we store grain and produce in these so that we can then transport them later. Okay, And so in this large-scale farming example, you can clearly see here those dots. And they were always, each one represents one of those tall buildings. And then their label next to it, silos. So we know that the produce that's being farmed on this land quite extensively, because those are very large farms. You can see the dividing line is quite far apart, okay? And so what we can say is that that farm produce is being stored in the silos until they then decide to transport it out on the transport routes, the various transport routes. So the commercial farming is definitely what is happening here because of all of those reasons, but whether it is small scale or large scale is really just in terms of how dense that area of land is being used by lots of different little farms with smaller boundaries, making it a small piece of land, or is it one big farm that has boundaries far apart? Our other primary economic activity is mining, and that's obviously where we are extracting a mineral from the ground, from that ore, that rock. We're then going to sell that mineral on, and industry will then beneficiate it, or sometimes the mines beneficiate it to a point where it's in a bit more of a usable form, and then secondary industry can process it further into an actual usable product. And so with mining, there's really clear evidence of mining in a region. The first thing that we always look for is evidence of where we actually are digging. And so if you have a look for a big hole in an area where there is possibly an excavation site or open cast mining, that's going to be indicated by that excavation site symbol, so the circle with the lines going inwards. And that shows that there is a lot of digging taking place and that the actual rock is being removed from that region. Okay, so here's an example of an excavation site. The opposite is when I take the sediment out of the ground, it needs to go somewhere. So we need to dump that from the hole out and make an actual mine dump. And so the mine dumps are then going to be clear evidence of mining, and because that is obviously the big sand piles of the waste soil and rock that is now obviously left over. And so what we can see here is there's evidence across this whole map of those mine dumps. There isn't a circle around those lines, just showing the difference between the excavation site and the mine dumps. And so here you can see this whole region is covered in mine dumps. Okay, so there's another one. Got some mine dumps here. Again, lots of mine dumps built up here. Okay, so those are the clear indications that there is this interaction with the land, and we are removing our rock so that we can take the mineral out and then dumping the waste rock on the actual mine dump. All right. The other thing that we can see often attached is our slimes dams, and that is a part of the process of the beneficiation. We're trying to actually remove the mineral from the rock, from the ore, and in that process there's going to be waste products. There's water that's part of the process of trying to get the mineral out, often in a process of flocculation. We use chemicals and water, and it binds to the mineral and or the impurities and helps to separate them out, mineral, water, and impurity, or whatever they're doing. And so often we have slimes dams, so dams that have been created to actually just store the wastewater, okay, or the waste product from that process. And you can consider what the actual environmental impact or potential effect of slimes dams could be on the surrounding land if they had to spill. Okay, so those kinds of questions can then be added there. Often we can see for mining that especially if they have to move that rock somewhere, we will see evidence of conveyor belts. Okay, so here you can see extensive network of conveyor belts that are being labeled, taking that actual mineral or rock that holds the mineral to a processing plant. And lastly, surrounding our mines is always a source of water, because we use water quite extensively in mining in order to help to actually extract our ore sometimes, but also through that beneficiation process of removing it from the ore. And so there you have furrows across the entire mine, funneling or channeling that water from a water source to the actual mine. So those are those man-made kind of gutters. And the furrows can sometimes also then be linked to canals, bigger ones, to help to divert that flow. Okay. Now, once you have taken that mineral out, you need to move it to the next location to be processed. And so that obviously requires accessibility to a transport route. Mining often is associated with very heavy material. We have heavy rock bearing or ore bearing mineral, or ore bearing the mineral. And so that heavy material often needs to be carried by railway so that we can support that weight. And so you will really see extensive railway systems, or really well laid out railway systems near the mines. Okay. Then our next thing that we often see in a South African context is our dormitory towns, because mining is not just a mechanical process. We use a lot of human labor in our actual mining process, and these dormitory towns are set up. Really, it's creating a residential suburb or area near the mine, because mines aren't going to be located necessarily where the best location is to settle. Okay, this is a lovely piece of land with a nice view and lots of water. They're going to be located wherever the mineral is, and often these places are in less desirable locations, isolated, and so there isn't anywhere to live. And so for the workers to actually be able to easily work on the mine in daily work or in shifts, they need to live close to that source of work. So in a South African context, and especially during the apartheid era, we would have to set up dormitory towns or areas for where workers could live. Now, the development of this during apartheid would mean that the dormitory towns were often separated from the main town that surrounded the mine. And so that was really in line with the Group Areas Act, and where certain race groups had to live in certain areas. But if we focus on this in terms of just from a mining and economic activity perspective, we're looking at the fact that labourers had to then live within those dormitory towns, and obviously needed various services and facilities that are surrounding the dormitory town in order to live there for long periods of time. Workers wouldn't necessarily live there permanently. They would often travel, okay, and stay there for certain periods of time and then go back home to their families. But it then ensured that there was this access to the job, and that you didn't have to then travel and increase costs for your job being so far away, okay. And then we need to consider what is the ecological impact. And so consider if there is lots of open cast mining, okay, with those excavation sites and big excavation sites. Consider the size of it. Think about the fact that that can scar the landscape quite extensively, that the more we turn the soil and remove vegetation is the protective covering, we're going to increase our rate of erosion of the land. And sometimes, often mines will have to have a rehabilitation plan. They'll have to have a plan on how they're going to lower their ecological impact on the environment, but that doesn't mean that it always is going to follow that plan and end up being like that in a positive aspect in terms of impact. And so we have to consider how biodiversity in the area is destroyed by just the land being used, large extensive areas of land being used, vegetation being destroyed out of an area to make space for the mine. Potentially the pollution that comes out of the actual slimes dams or the groundwater that's being polluted by the beneficiation process. We get that acid mine drainage, okay, and there we find that we are polluting our water. You could also find that the land becomes very unstable as well, and so we're increasing our chances of tectonic, not tectonic activity, but the tremors and rock instability that can occur in the area. Okay, then that is the primary activity. If we have a look at our industrial activity, this is part of the secondary sector. And we know that the two main types of industry are either going to be light or heavy. Light is obviously where we are producing smaller products, less pollution in the process, less noise, air pollution, water pollution in the process. And so often these products can be made close to where people live. People can often work within light industry as well, so people are part of the manufacturing process. It's going to obviously be more ideal to be closer to where people live, but they're not creating such a huge problem in terms of disturbance and in terms of land use. They're not repelling other types of land use away from them. Whereas with heavy industry, there's certainly a lot of in terms of functional magnetism, we repel our heavy industries away from our residential suburbs and built up areas. And that is because heavy industry has lots of pollution, lots of air, water, noise pollution. You don't want to live near one of those factories. And also the products are really quite big, bulky. They need lots of space. So generally you're going to find more space outside of the city. And the land is going to be cheaper if you're trying to buy large amounts of land to create a massive factory. The land is cheaper further out of the city. Okay. How do we see these industries on a map? We look for the big black blocks, okay, because those big black blocks indicate a higher density of building development and the surface area being really great. Now, there's two ways that, obviously the bigger the building, the more we can assume they probably want to be further out so they can utilize that cheaper land. But what we want to focus on here is really how close it is to an actual built up suburb where people are living. And so in this example, if you have a look at the black buildings here, they are actually located really quite close. There's a density of them scattered about over here, okay? And we can then assume that those might have a little bit more of a lighter function. Although Sasol, this is Sasol and it's a map of Sasolburg, the whole town has developed around the heavy industry, so we actually sometimes then can say, well, you disregarding that rule of living near heavy industry because it's the whole function of the town. So people want to live there because that's the source of work. But generally, if you're applying it to other areas, the closer that those industries are to your actual suburbs, okay, your surrounding grey shaded area, the more likely they are to be light industry. What you also want to notice here in this example is that there is a region here with black blocks that is not going to be necessarily industry. And we have to always look at our other symbols that surround those features. And the other symbols here, you can see clearly, is a W, which is on our maps indicating Winkel, shop, okay? And so that could indicate a big shopping center. And you've also got hospitals, which need lots and lots of floor space. You've got your police station there, you've got your post office. So there really is a collection of services, but the buildings that are using a large area of land are the hospital and the shopping center. Okay, so look for those other symbols. Another one that often is going to show up, and you can see that I've actually highlighted it here incorrectly, is our schools. Schools use large surface area, big roof space, big floor space, okay? And that is obviously not going to be that light industry that we are linking to that region. The heavy industry, further away from where people are living, I mean, it's fairly close to, in this example still, but you want to note that it is still at a distance, okay, from where people are living. So if we just look at, here's our industrial region, got a bit of a buffer of a road, our residential and then the actual industrial. Another thing that we always need to consider is the factors of why we chose to put that industry in that region. Always refer to the factors that influence the location of secondary industry. Why would we put that industry there? And those are things that we need to consider, like the availability of flat land. Okay, so we are looking at how flat the land is for those big buildings. It's easier to build on flat land if you're going to build really big buildings. It's cheaper, okay? Less engineering. Then what you're going to look at is also having a power source. And also on a map, how do we see flat land? Well, we look for the spacing of the contour lines. Here you can see contour lines are very far apart, so that land in that region is nice and flat. We need a power source, so you're going to see your power cables. Okay, there's the power lines coming into the area, bringing in energy and electricity to power those machines and factories. A labor source, so sometimes with the dormitory towns again, but also a suburb or a town where people can actually live and then work at that particular region, like here in Sasolburg, where we have the town developed around that actual industry, and so people want to live there to work in the industry. Extensive transport infrastructure, it's the whole processing of the product and moving the product on depending on what you're making, but you need to have that those major routes, either national highways, your main arterial routes. You're going to sometimes also have railway systems, okay? So you're going to have that extensive railway network helping to move those products along. And then another thing is, again, the water sources. We're not going to have the dams as much, but mainly what we're looking for here is our furrows and our canals, okay? So here you can see quite an extensive network of furrows taking the water from the river and diverting it into the industry, and lots of storage of water. Here's your reservoirs. You've also got pipelines as well, piping the water. So there's lots of pipelines bringing water into the industry, and that's also a really good indication of the setup of bringing water to that location, making that location ideal. So the question could be, what factors are benefiting the location of industry in this region? And then we can also bring this example of our light industry to our little town of Ashton, because we can see that the industry is located over here near the actual residential zone, okay? And the other clue is that surrounding the area is a whole bunch of farming. And so we can then assume that the product of the primary economic activity of farming is being processed in that light industry. So it's going to travel directly into the factories. We would say that that light industry is a good example also of raw material orientation. So the factories have located near the source of raw material so that they can process that raw material, pop it onto the train or onto that road and move it out.